Hey guys, Ramsey here. Welcome to another video. Today we have a Vintage Hall of Fame review. And I have to clarify some things because initially I said I was going to do only my absolute favorites as Vintage Hall of Fame fragrances. So that would be the Bel Amis, the Antaises, the Coro, stuff like that, right? And then I really got to thinking about it. And, my category for vintage is 20 plus years or older, right? So that's going to put us at 2004 and older. And many of the discontinued fragrances that I have reviewed on the channel, for example, I reviewed a fragrance that would technically fit into that category, Cristobal by Balenciaga, but that doesn't fall into the Vintage Hall of Fame category for me, so I've been calling them discontinued design or discontinued gems, okay? And so today we're going to talk about a fragrance that is, I would not put it in my top 10, okay? But it's so pivotal it's like a linchpin fragrance to me, or a capstone. The capstone is the stone that goes on the top that holds everything in place. Or if you're building an arch, the capstone can be kind of the stone in the middle that holds the arch together, right? And so this is a capstone fragrance. And it's released by Pierre Cardin, and it's from 1972. It's called Pour Monsieur. It was also originally called Man's Cologne in different markets. I know Pierre Cardin kind of did different things in Europe and America and stuff like that. And this is going to be a little bit of a ramble of a video. Sometimes I have a clear and concise path of what I want to say and how I want to say it. And sometimes I go in rambling. I am going in rambling with this one because I've been thinking about how to review this fragrance for a long, long time. And even now, as I hit play, I'm not 100% sure how to say what I want to say, if that makes sense, because there's so many directions this fragrance goes. It's so multifaceted, both in its cultural aspects, where it sits in history, and what it meant for fragrances going forward. So a little bit of a ramble, first of all, on the bottle. Everyone looks at this bottle and they think, what? Microphone. There's a tower in Dallas called Reunion Tower that has a ball on top. That always reminds me of it. I've heard some people say, using the dirty part of their mind, and they'll say it looks like a vibrator or whatever you want to call it. And so the bottle is, let's say, what everybody focuses on, okay? And what's interesting, in my bottle is a made in France bottle. Now the newer ones, sometimes you'll see have like a PC on the top right here of the cap. The older ones don't, I don't believe. And there is, if you're interested in reading all of that, you can see the distributor from Paris, and this is the Eau de Toilette. There is also an Eau de Cologne, which I've never smelled, but I hear the Eau de Toilette's actually better. You can see here it says UTIF, which I believe means that this came out before the European Union was officially formed. So this puts it probably sometime in the early 90s, maybe late 80s, early 90s. I don't know exactly how old this bottle is. I know that the person selling it to me had no clue about fragrances, and he sold it to me for like 10 bucks, which for 30 mils of this precious vintage juice made in France, I'll take it all day, every day. The new ones are made by 5-Star Fragrances, or I think now it's made by Coty or something. I don't know, but I hear it's been heavily reformulated over the years. In fact, I have a vintage bottle of Blue Marine, which is not necessarily a flanker, but you can see they put it in the exact same bottle. And this is a Schulten release. And I'll be reviewing this in a Vintage Hall of Fame review as well one of these days. And you can see that this one's made in Clifton, New Jersey. So this is made in America, this is made in France. So anyways, Pierre Cardin is kind of a designer that is all over the place. He is a designer who had a thing for space age creations. And so if you follow sort of designer trends and what was going on, you're probably familiar with another designer called Francesco Robanetta. Excuse me, I think it's Robanetta. Paco Rabanne, basically. And Paco Rabanne also did the space age thing. If you kind of watch his shows or whatever, you see the girls in the metal outfits, very space age designer. And so this has a little bit of that in it. And so along with the things that I said, Reunion Tower, microphone, vibrator, it could also be a spaceship. And so, that space theme is something that Pierre Cardin and Paco Rabanne were popular for in the 60s and 70s. And if I'm not mistaken, this is the very first fragrance release that Pierre Cardin had. And it was a huge hit in the 1970s. Apparently this and Halston Z14 you smelled everywhere on men in the 70s, along with Paco Rabanne. Paco Rabanne was the scent, my father's signature scent, if you will. He's worn Paco Rabanne my whole life. And so Pour Monsieur is very interesting because, you know, if you look at the advertisements, also, by the way, I should say, if you just look at it this way, the advertisement that I saw has almost like a man walking, right? And the outline of this almost looks like you're looking at him through a keyhole, right? So it's like a keyhole, and the advertisements have it shown next to keys, watches. Back then it showed a lighter as well because people smoked in the 70s. Cufflinks, you know, that all match the watch and the lighter. And the two blurbs that I saw, one is what the well-dressed man is wearing. That's one. But the one I like even more is today is too important to wear anything else. Pierre Cardin Man's Cologne, or Pour Monsieur. So that is a little quick blurb into what we're up against here. And it's interesting because Pierre Cardin, the designer himself, let's say he blew up, and he absolutely blew up, but he blew up in a fashion to where he started to put his name on absolutely everything. You could buy Pierre Cardin boxers, I'm sure. You could buy Pierre Cardin pens. You could buy, actually Pierre Cardin purchased Maxim's restaurant in Paris, which is famous for where Christian Dior liked to eat. You know, if you ever have seen some of the new Dior releases, Vanilla Diorama, I think, was one of them, is named after a dessert he used to get at Maxim's. And so Maxim's was actually owned by Pierre Cardin at one point in time. Along with that, the Devil Man on Bass Notes, he says that you could even put Pierre Cardin trim on certain cars. You go down to General Motors and buy a car in the 70s, you can get Pierre Cardin trim on there, which is just outrageous how much he licensed his name on absolutely everything. Anything and anyone who wanted Pierre Cardin could get it. And I think that maybe lowered the brand's quality. Not lowered the brand's quality, but lowered the perceived value or the perceived way that a consumer saw the brand, right? So exclusive brands didn't put themselves in, you know, Hugo's, right? If you were going to get a Gucci trim on your car, you would expect it to be in your Bentley or Range Rover or whatever it is. You're not going to get it in your Chevy Malibu. Do they even make the Malibu anymore? I don't think they do, but you get my point, right? So he just put his name on everything, and I think it diminished the perceived luxuriousness of the brand. On top of that, this is a drugstore fragrance. I mean, to me, it doesn't smell like a drugstore fragrance. I am smelling the vintage, so you have to keep that in mind. If you're smelling a modern version, it may be different. I hear it is different, but I don't think this smells like a drugstore fragrance, but I bought this for $10, right? I mean, that's honestly what it goes for. I've seen these bottles at TJ Maxx for $5, $6.99, $7.99, $9.99, right? You can get like 200 ml bottles for 20 bucks or something. So it is a true proper cheapie. But when you think about the man, Pierre Cardin, he was one of the, I think, all-time great designers, of all time. You have to put him up there with the greatest of the great. And he was a designer as well as an architect. In fact, one of the fragrances that I reviewed on this channel is a fragrance called 1740 by Histoire de Parfum. I've reviewed this fragrance on the channel. You can go check out my full review. But the original name of the fragrance was 1740 Marquis de Sade. And Marquis de Sade was a very sick man, but he wrote a crazy book. And if you're interested in that kind of thing, you can go check it out. Go check out my review of 1740 if you want to learn more about it. But the reason I bring this up is that Pierre Cardin bought the castle that Marquis de Sade used to own when he was alive back in the day. And it's literally a castle. And he would throw parties and, you know, design parties. And he just kind of, moved to his own beat, if that makes sense. So releasing something that I think is so far ahead of the curve that it took the rest of the world in fragrance 10 years or so to catch up. And I'll explain what I mean by that as we go along. Is just perfect for Pierre Cardin. It fits exactly into that space age, futuristic designer that him and Paco Rabanne, and you can see the metal. You know, they didn't put metal on fragrances back in the day, you didn't have metal like this. This was like a space age, futuristic looking design back then, which sounds crazy now, but back then that was kind of the idea. And so this is a proper linchpin, and it's linking fragrances. When I first smell this, so basically it's going to be very hard to describe, but when I first smell the fragrance, especially from this bottle, I get a lot instantly. The very first thing it reminds me of is this. And you're like, well, what the hell is behind door number 1? And I'll show you what it is. It's a fragrance from 1963, which I have reviewed on the channel, and it's called Monsieur Lanvin. And there goes the decant. But Monsieur Lanvin. Go check out my review on this. Monsieur Lanvin is probably one of the most, I would say, perfect iterations of a vintage masculine from the 50s or 60s that uses this hardcore civet note, okay? Now, there's no civet in Pour Monsieur, or if there is, there's the tiniest bit where you don't get the civet hit that you get in Monsieur Lanvin, but I want you to think of that sort of citrus chypre-like smell. And this is not a citrus chypre, by the way. This is going to be classified as the very first amber fougere. So the reason why this is such a linchpin is it harkens back to the past. And if you've smelled these citrusy, fragrances like Moustache, Eau de Cologne Concentree, if you've smelled things like Rouge by Guerlain, if you've smelled things like Jicky, or even you could say, if you've ever smelled this little bad boy right here, Mouchoir de Monsieur by Guerlain, there's a little bit of this sort of lemony lavender thing that you get in the opening, and I don't think Rouge has a huge hit of lavender in the opening, but there is this sort of lavender lemon combination that's going to remind you of vintage masculine fragrances before 1972. Fragrances that were vintage, let's say, even when this came out, okay, in 1972. Think about that. So I'm talking vintage when this came out. And so you're hit with some of those fragrances from the past, but there is a chord in here that is going to be iconic for future fragrances to come, okay? And actually, it ends up, the road splits. It's iconic for what I call amber fougères going forward. So a fougère structure basically has that lavender, it has geranium, and it has that tonka bean in the base, right? Coumarin, tonka bean, whatever you want to call it. There's usually oak moss in there as well. Well, the amber fougère takes that and, of course, adds this oriental touch to it. And I love that. I've always loved it. From the moment I smelled it, I loved it. And this kind of sent us down this path where we started to get things like Cerruti's Fair Play in the early 80s. Now, this is 72, so the early 80s fragrances started to pick up on it. Then we got Zeno, which kind of changed the game. And I've gone through this before. And then we started to get things like, later on, we got Heritage, which is like the peak. So it took 20 years to go from the amber fougère that kind of really placed the flag, right? Now we're entering the new, it's like the spacemen placing the flag on the moon, right? Staying with the spaceman theme. And it took 20 years to get to Guerlain's Heritage from this. And so that's why it's so pivotal, because yes, it harkens to the past. And when you smell it, when I try to describe it, if you know some of these vintage masculine fragrances, especially in the opening, you're going to get that opening hit of lemon and basil and lavender and bergamot that's going to really remind you of the past, all right? There's also some spices in there which are not listed. I don't know what they are, but there's definitely a little bit of a spicy hit that is blended in here, very well blended. And so this amber fougère category was created by Pour Monsieur, but it also created a category of fragrances which turned into my all-time favorites, and that is the heavy patchouli, honey, animalic fragrances like Givenchy Gentleman. So if you take the patchouli in this, and I think there's a little bit of honey in here that's not listed, okay? But if you take this honeyed patchouli, which Givenchy Gentleman would then take the civet back from Monsieur Lanvin, stick it back in here, and you're basically, now you've got one of my all-time favorite patchoulis off of sort of a DNA that began to inspire it here. You also have things like Jovan Sex Appeal, which I think came out 1 year after Givenchy Gentleman. So you can see why this absolutely had to be a Vintage Hall of Fame review. Even though it's not in my top 10 fragrances or anything like that, I respect the hell out of this fragrance. Respect the hell out of it. It basically smells like a barbershop powdery. There's a powdery aspect to it because of the oriental side of it. The sandalwood is also vintage in scope. It's not this smooth, milky sandalwood, but it's not a modern harsh, it's not the modern punchy sandalwood that you're thinking about. The sandalwood in here mixes with the iris, and the iris is not too prominent. It's not an iris note that you're going to pick out and go, oh man, that is iris. It's an iris note that you're going to notice because of the powderiness. I mean, it literally smells like talcum powder. Like, you know when you get your hair cut and they shave the back of your neck, the barber will put some baby powder or talc powder on his or her hands and put it on your neck, right? That is kind of the powdery feel of this fragrance. It's definitely, there's a barbershop element. There's a vintage masculine element, which actually in the old days usually had some sort of barbershop element. And so you think about that vintage masculine barbershop element with the powderiness and then overlaid with the amber fougere. And you have this little bad boy. So let's go through the notes. And we'll talk about some things that came to mind while I was wearing it. It's actually a really tough fragrance to describe because I've been reviewing a lot of things like niche fragrances and stuff like that. And I do have vintage reviews on my channel, obviously. But this fragrance in particular is just such a... It's like a note that just hits you. I mean, it's just like, you know, it's like, this is like a missile and it just hits you when you wear it. And it's very hard to distinguish other than stages in the fragrance where I can say, okay, the first stage has that lemony vintage feel that's going to harken back a little bit to Abbey Rouge and Jicky and Mouchoir de Monsieur. And it's got a little bit of that, you know, lavender feel that Jicky has. With the vintage feel, but then it morphs. And the second stage turns into the powdery sandalwood. The patchouli really starts to come out more. A little bit of that honey makes an appearance, which they did not list. And, you know, probably the middle stage, what I get a lot on my skin is the carnation. So you kind of get this old school carnation, which I absolutely love. I was going to pull out the carnation sort of essential oil and dip it so you guys could see the actual carnation absolute, but I figured I'm surrounded by bottles talking about this thing, so I figured that was enough. But there's definitely this spicy carnation geranium feel. The geranium is slightly rosy, slightly peppery. Maybe that's also where the spiciness comes from in this fragrance, because geranium can come across as spicy, and also carnation can come across as spicy. I love carnation. It's a masculine perfume floral that needs to come back. They need to bring that back more. People view it as old school. I don't view it as old school. People view this fragrance as old school. It's funny, if you watch the reviews, there are folks that are like, man, this smells exactly like 1972. How could anyone wear this today? You know what I was thinking? There is a Celine fragrance that brought back a version of Caron's Pour un Homme. This came out in 1934. Celine put out a fragrance that smells exactly like this to me, but it had like a yeast note or something, or a barley note or something. And people are walking around wearing it like it's the best new thing. And they're just walking around wearing it, so what? They smell like a fragrance from 1934. What's wrong with wearing a fragrance from 1972? I don't think there's anything wrong with this at all. In fact, I had to go today to the doctor, and I had to give blood. And the lady that was taking the blood, she just goes, "You smell nice." And I did my usual. I never make a big deal out of it. I'm never like, "Oh yeah, that's right. Look at me." I always play it this way. I always just say, "Thank you." That's it. I don't want to make a big deal. I probably wouldn't even talk about it if I didn't have a channel, because it doesn't matter to me. You know, there are some people I think that wear fragrances for compliments. My guess is you'll probably be disappointed with this. Most people probably will not notice this. She wasn't an older woman, but she was probably in her upper 30s, maybe low 40s if I had to guess. And so I think that this is a fragrance that will, I think if you're around women and maybe their father, grandfather, uncle wore this, they very well may pick up this DNA. It's funny. Many people say you don't get compliments wearing these type of fragrances, but I get random, maybe you wouldn't call that a compliment per se, but a comment, let's say. I get comments wearing my vintage fragrances out all the time, just because I think it's so different, and that's what it's all about. And it's a $10 fragrance is what's crazy about it. So here, let me go through the note listing with you, and then I'll talk a little bit about something that came to mind today, and we'll wrap this bad boy up. So top is bergamot, lavender, lemon, orange, and basil. Now, when you spray, along with that sort of Monsieur Lanvin, Jicky, lavender, lemon that you're going to get, along with that powdery spiciness, you're also going to get a little bit of orange. And what ends up happening is that orange is almost like an alert. It's like orange alert, okay? And that orange alert is like signaling the coming of the ambery dry down, if you will. It's because orange can sometimes come across as a little bit sweet. Some people say the orangey feel in here is quite cloying if you wear it in the heat. I disagree. I mean, today it was 70 degrees, cloudy, overcast, 60s and low 70s. It's February 9th or whatever it is today, February 9th. And, it's going to rain here this weekend, but this worked beautifully. I've worn this in the summer. I've had no problems. I've worn this in the winter. I've had no problems. So I don't think that the oriental aspects of this force you to wear this fragrance in cool weather necessarily, but there are some people that will tell you that. There are also some people that will tell you that orange feel will remind you of another fragrance, because again, everything reminds of everything else that came later in the 70s that was probably also inspired by this, and that's Lagerfeld Classique or Cologne, which is on my Vintage Hall of Fame review list. And this takes that orange aspect and really amps it up. It takes the powdery aspect here and really amps it up. But I absolutely love this stuff. Discontinued. Unbelievably, Pierre Cardin's Pour Monsieur, according to Parfumo, is not discontinued. It says it's still in production, which is shocking to me. That is absolutely shocking to me, especially at $10 or whatever the hell this sells for nowadays. So yes, they say it's still in production, but you can see the influences that this fragrance had on future fragrances to come, right? This is a monster influencer. This is a fragrance that is the daddy or granddaddy or great-granddaddy of so many fragrances that I love, and probably you love as well if you love vintage fragrances. So so the note listing is bergamot, lavender, lemon, orange, and basil. Now, that basil basically gives you a little bit of an earthy, herbal touch in the opening, but it's not super prominent, at least not from my bottle. This is the only bottle I've ever smelled. So people that are saying, it's changes as from different formulations, I can't speak to that. But for my bottle that I have here, this one, the basil just adds a little hint of background herbal earthiness. It doesn't make it super green, but it adds a little bit of natural freshness to an otherwise fairly synthetic smelling composition. Okay, I will give the haters that. There are some people that hate this stuff. They say it's synthetic, cheap. Anything you buy for $10 is cheap. Bullshit. I don't agree with that at all. But I will release the point. I will. What's the word I'm looking for? I'll agree to the point that it is synthetic. Okay, it smells slightly synthetic, but for this money, I mean, these type of fragrances, this was also in a similar boat, Jovan Sex Appeal. I love Sex Appeal as well. I think this is a fantastic fragrance. You used to be able to buy this at the drugstore for $10 or whatever it is. And these type of fragrances that are made, they're not going to have the ambergris and all the expensive materials usually. So you have to have your expectations set. But just from a lover of perfume and a lover of fragrances and a lover of what this influenced, you have to appreciate this. It's a pure gem. So the heart is patchouli, which again is the patchouli that I think inspired the patchouli of the 1970s. Some of my favorite patchoulis from the 70s I think were inspired by this. You could also put Giorgio Beverly Hills, which I thought I had here, but I couldn't find it. It was probably under lock and key somewhere. But I'll review that as well. That's on my to review list. Leather. Now, this is actually in Parfumo called a spicy leathery scent. I disagree. I don't think, well, first of all, there's no spices listed, so how is it a spicy scent? And second of all, I don't think the leather plays a prominent role. I wouldn't call this a leather fragrance. I would call this an amber fougere with some leathery touches, okay? Sandalwood, which we already talked about. Iris, we already talked about. Carnation and geranium, we already talked about. And then the base is the amber, leather, moss, oak moss, vanilla, benzoin, and tonka bean. So that rounds out the proper amber fougere. And you know, it's funny, as I was thinking about maybe an interesting way to describe this scent to you, there was a song that kept popping into my head today while I was wearing it. And it was David Bowie's Space Oddity, right? And the papers want to know what shirt you wear. So, don't worry, I won't do that again. But there is a song from 1972, and I didn't realize it came out in 1972 until I looked it up. But apparently, Elton John's Rocket Man came out in 1992, or 1972, excuse me, which is a perfect song for this. That's like the song. I mean, this is literally a rocket. And so with Pierre Cardin's Space Age, Elton John's Rocket Man from 72, although for some reason David Bowie's Space Oddity I think fits this better, but you get the idea. They both play in the same genre of music, if you will. And I just thought that was an interesting musical comparison if you want like a companion for Pierre Cardin's Pour Monsieur. So I think we've pretty much covered all aspects. To me, it starts off like a vintage masculine with that lemony, powdery barbershop talc powder-like feel, and it sort of dries into this very interesting, spicy patchouli with that geranium and carnation. The carnation is pretty prominent on my skin along with the geranium. It's like a 1-2 punch of florals. And then it dries into that amber fougere category that inspired so many of my all-time favorites. And Pierre Cardin, I just have to say, his aesthetic, I wish I had the cap for this. This was actually a gift from my good friend Anuj. And but the cap on this bad boy makes it seem like this is like a fencing mask right here. You know, I mean, the designs, you would never see this nowadays, ever. And there's a line of Pierre Cardin fragrances, which I'm going to talk about. These two are definitely on the 2 review list. These are 2 discontinued, you know, vintage fragrances that are must sniffs if you're a vintage lover. But also these are going to be harder for you to find. But there's an entire line called the Centaur line. And they come like this. Look at this. Look at this packaging. I love it. And some people will say, yeah, it's cheap plastic, but I love this. I think this is elegant, like the knight on a chessboard. And each one of these is a banger. There is not a bad one in this set. And there's one more that I have, I think that's not in here. And then I think there's one that I'm missing that they released that didn't come in this scent. This one actually smells like Queer Moresque by Serge Luton, and they both came out around the same time in the 90s. That always interests me. But yes, what can I say? I mean, just a hell of a line. And also, to make this even more special, is this is the first Pierre Cardin I've reviewed on the channel, which is absolutely shocking to me that I have not reviewed a Pierre Cardin on the channel. But this is the first, so you're going to see more. You're definitely going to see more between Pierre Cardin's Blue Marine, Enigme de Pierre Cardin, and then the whole Centaur line, which each one of these deserves an individual review. So Pour Monsieur is just an absolute legend, an icon of a scent as far as I'm concerned. And this deserves a Vintage Hall of Fame review. So it's hard to go into details because the scent, like I said, it's very hard to go, okay, the sandalwood note smells like this, the leather note smells like this, because the scent doesn't come at you like that. It's one of the reasons why I think I've procrastinated on doing this review for so long, because it's just blended in a way. And vintage fragrances, you know, now I feel like the perfumers and the houses make it a point. They want you to smell each and every note. They want it to be separated. And before, everything kind of hit you like a ball. You know, it just hit you all at once. And you had to quickly navigate what you're smelling. And sometimes you just can't split it up. It's an accord. It's not like you're smelling the lavender here, the leather here. But the fragrance does come at you in waves, and those waves that I've described are kind of how I experience the fragrance. So that's my take. I'm sure that with a fragrance like this, where it basically took the industry a decade, I don't know of any other amber fougères, as I would call them, as I've labeled them, that came before. I think Nino Cerruti's Fair Play is kind of the first one that really hit me in a way that this one did. And I can kind of see the link. So look at the jump. I mean, we're talking about a decade. If you know any amber fougères that fell in the 70s that came after this, let me know, unless I'm just having a brain fart and I missed it. But I really can't think of any until the 80s where the trend just took off. So that's how far ahead of the times Pierre Cardin was, a true icon. Masterpiece, I don't know if I would call it a masterpiece, but I think it's an icon and an influential fragrance of its time. So I'm sure all of you out there, you vintage lovers, have a father who wore this, you know, an uncle, a grandfather. This is probably a signature scent of a very important man in your life, teacher, barber, anyone who you used to know, coach from back in the day. You know, this is, and I love wearing these type of fragrances, by the way. So this is a pleasure. I'll enjoy the rest of this bottle. Glad to knock out the review. Let me know what you think. Appreciate everyone watching, as always. We just about hit, if we haven't, or will hit 7,000 subscribers. So thank you. Maybe tomorrow we'll do our 7,000 subscriber bash. It's going to be a hell of a video. Maybe Sunday. We'll see how it goes. But yes, good times at Channel Ram. Thanks for watching. Cheers, guys. Catch you next time. Bye-bye.